請勿靠近車門。
請不要靠近車門。
Please stand back from the doors.
Welcome back to What Kind of Asian Are You podcast, a podcast featuring conversations about being Asian. I am your host. My name is Kyle. Thank you so much for listening. And if you want to continue supporting the podcast, you can just share this with your friends and families. Follow us on Instagram at What Kind of Asian Pod. Subscribe to us on YouTube at What Kind of Asian Are You podcast. And give us a rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. That will really help us grow and help us get the guests that you want us have on this podcast. And for this week, we got a special one for you. We got Alisha Gupta, and I found her through Instagram, where she posts a lot about social activism, youth empowerment, her journey being an entrepreneur, and all the stuff that she's doing while being a full-time student at UT Austin. It's really interesting to hear her story about being South Asian while being American, and also all the stuff she's looking to do to make an impact to the community that she cares about. I think it's a very insightful one that you will get a lot from. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. And now, Alisha Gupta. All right, and today we have Alisha on the show. Alisha, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Kyle. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's nice to be able to talk to you because we've been hoping to get this done, scheduled, and finally we got it done. And I'm very happy to have you because I've been going through like kind of I want to say discovery of a lot of other Asians in the community doing great things, but I feel like I'm kind of doing that with this show, and you're one of those that kind of people or like accounts or like whatever you call it these days in terms of like on social media, like that's I see putting a lot of work and effort into helping the community that you care for and all that stuff. And you're starting it where it's like you're still in school and all that stuff. So I'm really impressed by that. I really want to hear your story, hear why you're doing it, all that fun stuff. And I want to get started with what I usually ask my guests with the beginning of the show is, what kind of Asian are you? And we can start from there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I first want to say thank you so much, Kyle, for having me. It means a lot that you were able to reach out through my page, because I think that just gives validity to what I was doing on the page, which is a lot of activism and youth empowerment, not only for my demographics, but for anyone who is looking to make a change, but definitely have a place in my heart for South Asian activism. So my parents are from India. My mom's actually from Mumbai or Bombay, and my dad's from Lucknow and then moved to Bangalore. But both of them immigrated here, college and then post-college graduate years. And I was actually born and raised in San Jose, California, and recently moved to Austin. So the question, what kind of Asian am I, is funny because I get that question a lot in a different verbiage, where people ask me, where are you from? And I never really know how to answer that question because I'm from the United States, but I'm also Indian and Desi. And so it's kind of playing with that duality of culture, being an Asian American.
That's a great answer. And like adding on to what you said about like, people asking you that often, like, where you're from and stuff. Do you feel like you are annoyed? But I don't want to say annoyed, but are you kind of tired of hearing it in terms of like you say that verbiage, or like where are you from, that kind of thing? Or like, do you have like a set response now to be like for those that you don't want to have to explain more to? Or like you would actually like kind of sit them down and like, hey, here's my story and how this is how you should address it? Because I think without us doing that, and let's say as being like Asian diaspora, they often be like, where you're from, and that's it, the very surface level, right? So do you have kind of any kind of points to that?
Honestly, I used to, when I was a little bit younger, I think I got very annoyed quickly when people couldn't wrap their head around this idea of an immigrant child. But as I grow up, I think the question, where are you from, was just more a reflection of my own identity. So how I wanted to answer that depended on how I wanted to, represent myself. And I think a big part of that representation does come from my South Asian background. And so now it's just, where are you from? I'm Desi, I'm Indian. These are the things in my culture that we respect, and these are traditions that we uphold. I'm really into Bollywood dancing and the South Asian fashion, and that's all part of where I'm from. But another part of where I'm from is growing up in the Bay Area and going to a Catholic school. And so when I get asked that question, I like to incorporate both things, just because I think that shows more my principles and my passions, versus before I think I would have just honed down into like this confusion of not being understood. So I think definitely growing up has helped me just frame myself a little bit better and do some introspection to say, what message do I want to put out there, instead of getting annoyed that people couldn't really understand maybe some of the nuances of being an immigrant child, help them understand through storytelling.
That's awesome. And I like how you mentioned, like, yeah, I put an emphasis on saying, like, I am, yes, like a child of immigrants, and like how you have your kind of South Asian culture, but also you're still from from San Jose, still very American. You went to Catholic school, because I think so much of like at least media representation of how Asians are is often like you're either very Asian or you're like very assimilated and American. But I think we need to show more of like the picture of like, well, we could be those two, of course, but also don't forget that there's a lot of people that feel like they're very much both Asian and also American at the same time, without taking away from any of those sides. And I think from the content I see you put out, or at least how I see you from like just online, is that you represent that really well, and I really like that. And talking more about just your childhood, so you said you went to like Catholic school, and also you got involved in a lot of like South Asian kind of cultural stuff. Can you just talk about like overall how was your childhood and what was that like?
Yeah, for sure. It's actually kind of funny because growing up, when I was in elementary school and then even going into middle school, I was in a predominantly Asian and predominantly South Asian schools. So I kind of felt like I was living in this bubble, and I thought that that was my world. Especially in the Bay Area, very, very Asian heavy in terms of demographics and the people living right next to me, my neighbors, the people in the public schools in my district. So I think I was getting a very one-sided picture to it. But it was a picture I was honestly comfortable with. I never faced many microaggressions. Everyone was bringing the same food to school. Everyone, celebrated Diwali together and had all these traditions that we were able to bond upon. Going into high school, however, I suddenly became a minority. And so I was just a handful of South Asians in a very predominantly Caucasian Catholic school. And I think reality hit me hard that we did have different upbringings. Me and my peers, we didn't celebrate the same holidays, or we didn't speak the same languages at home. Our parents raised us differently, where there was different standards and principles. I think there's one stereotype of like the strict South Asian parent or the strict Asian parent, and even if that's not present in my household, it's still like a stereotype or like an inside joke within the South Asian community that wasn't just necessarily understood by people outside of that community. And so I think that reality hit me hard, and I started facing more microaggressions, slight racism in my high school. And I think that's when I actually came to the realization that I wanted to do something about it. Backtracking a little bit, when I first entered high school as a freshman, I honestly wanted to assimilate with all the white people around me. I wanted to look like that perfect image of a girl, wanted to wear what they were wearing, wanted to do my makeup like them, straighten my hair like them. And I think that was a call to just be accepted. Because, when you're in this new environment and you're the outsider, all you can do is adjust. But I didn't realize that adjusting could take different forms. Adjusting could be, embracing my own culture to feel more comfortable in myself versus changing who I am to fit in. And so come almost, I want to say junior year, maybe even senior year is when I finally was like, there are things I love about my culture and I need to just stand for who I am. And I think Bollywood dance was a really, really big part of that. So I became the captain of my Bollywood dance team. And it wasn't easy at the school. There was a time where we were getting made fun of for the dance styles or mocked. But I think that just gave motivation to the cause of standing firm in your grounds of your culture. And so that Bollywood dance, and then also just a few nonprofits that I worked with as well. One such is Maitri, that works with South Asian victims of domestic violence and sex trafficking. I think I found my heart in that cause and wanted to help that out. So just getting involved with my South Asian community as much as possible definitely helped me ground myself with my roots.
That's awesome. And like hearing a lot how you like, oh, a lot of stuff that you're doing now that you really care for really started in high school so early, when a lot of times a lot of people are like, oh, I have this awakening like during college, or like, after when I got into workplace and stuff. It's so nice to hear that you really hone in what matters for you, and you really went in like go into like, oh, being nonprofits and such, helping your community. And my question, in addition to like, oh, like how was your experience working in nonprofits at a young age, volunteering and stuff, was like, what did your parents think about that? Because realistically, yes, it's nice that you're doing stuff, you're being like doing things that could help you in terms of your CV and all that stuff. But like thinking about, volunteering for a nonprofit that isn't really in a lot of immigrants family or immigrant parents, whereas like they would think, oh, maybe you should do well in your studies, of course, and then you participate in band music and all those stuff. But like participating in like volunteer activism stuff, I don't think they really think of much about that. How was your parents' reaction to that?
Yeah, so I was super, super lucky that my parents were really open-minded about all professions. There was a point in time where I wanted to go into activism and law full time, and they were 100% on board with that. And I think that has a lot to do with how, especially my mom, but both my parents grew up. They came to America very early. My mom actually lived in London for some of her time, and then came to the United States when she was 18. So just a year younger than how old I am right now. And both of them did start in kind of the traditional Asian path as engineers and CS and computer engineering. And both of them are now in the business world. And so I think they went through that transition and were more open-minded about me going and exploring all professions. And so when I was, doing school, but also doing activism and nonprofit entrepreneurship and volunteering, I think they had nothing but support for me. And that helped me tremendously in my confidence to build a platform and my confidence to just put myself out there for the cause that I believe in. And not all children or students are as lucky to have that support system. And for those people, I say, reach out to, your friends or other peers or even administration and teachers that do believe in such things, and your parents will come around when they see the great strides that you're making, because it is just a mental adjustment. But yeah, I was very, very fortunate to have them by my side through the whole thing. The one thing I will say is there is this fear for parents, especially for parents who were immigrants, because I mean, the general story of them working hours and hours just so they could raise their kids in the United States, right? And let us have that dream. And so we don't want to disappoint. So I think there's a lot of fear in the parents that we just want the best for the children. And the way that I was able to kind of squash that fear, especially when I was working with some serious issues like domestic violence and sex trafficking, was just through, again, storytelling. I love to emphasize that just because everyone has a different story and a different pathway, and everyone's definition of success is different. And so when I was able to sit them down and share stories of the work that I was doing, what I actually stood for, and the lives that I was affecting by the nonprofits I was able to get involved with, I think they were much more open to understanding this type of work. Obviously now I am going through business and marketing route, very, very similar to both my parents and what they do. But even then, I think it's just that general understanding that there's so many different paths for everybody. It's really what you were most passionate about.
That's awesome. And you brought up something that I want to talk a little bit about just because oftentimes when you hear about, immigrant parents and whatever, they could be however educated or whatnot, but sometimes they immigrate to the West at a later age, maybe in their late 20s, 30s, where there's a higher level of like assimilation or just understanding that they need. But for your instance, your parents, like you said, they immigrated to the United States at an earlier age, maybe like at like university level where like they know a certain bit of their own culture, but they're kind of immersed in the new culture as well and grew up for most part like understanding what American culture is and all that stuff. So how does that translate in terms of you and your parents kind of relationship in talking about these kind of like diaspora issues or like kind of like culture related to acceptance, identity, and all that stuff? Do you have those kind of conversation with them? Because oftentimes other immigrants kids would be like, it's really hard to talk to them, not even through like just language barriers, but just they don't get it because they never had that experience.
Yeah. My dad came a little bit later. My dad came when he was like in his 20s, late 20s. My mom came when she was 18. But that being said, they both came at a relatively early age compared to some other Asian or just immigrants in general. So those conversations were a little bit easier to start just because they had lived here for such a long time. But the one thing I want to say, Kyle, is, I think we think that coming to the United States means that, we're in our own world here and we have to make these adjustments and we're the only people with dual identities. But as I dug deeper and deeper into that issue, especially the issue about talking to your parents, just regardless of what the topic is, just the communication between a parent and a child, that issue is present regardless of where you're from. And if you take even India, for example, there's dual identities within the Indian community. I mean, you can be Punjabi and you can be like from a different Indian state. You can speak two languages, you can follow two different religions. Both my parents follow different religions. And so all of these issues are very, very present, regardless of if you're an immigrant child or not. And I think it boils down to the same issue of understanding that there is an age gap between you and your parents. And they went through a different generation than we're going through. And all of us are facing different identities just based on how rapidly the times are changing. And so first tackling that age gap and that mutual understanding of we're going through different experiences, but if we can hear out the experience that each of us are just, I guess, facing on a day-to-day basis, then it'll lead to so much bigger of an understanding.
Yeah, that I like how you mentioned that because I definitely agree. Like anyone in the world can have many multiple or like dual identities where it's just because of the environment they're in and all that stuff. It doesn't have to be like because of immigration. It could be a lot of other variables as well. I like how you mentioned that. And in terms of like what you're doing now, because you mentioned a lot, you're involved in activism, but you're also quite young. You're also like currently still in school. And can you just talk about what are you studying in school and all the stuff that you're busy doing in addition to handling a full semester workload, all that stuff?
Yeah, so I am currently a sophomore going into my second sophomore year semester at UT Austin. I'm double majoring in marketing and business honors with a minor in analytics and a certificate in entrepreneurship and creativity. So doing a lot of different things, hoping to kind of combine them all into a career in potentially marketing, but also in the VC space. I love working with startups. I love the marketing consulting era where I get to, talk to a startup, see how they can get customers on board, combine my knowledge of ventures and marketing and social media, all in one. And so I'm involved in orgs on campus that kind of combine the VC and the marketing space. I'm also heavily involved in my Bollywood dance team, carrying that from high school into college. And then my activism does come out in different ways. So before I was working with a lot of nonprofits, and I had even started my own nonprofit. And I think that taught me the ropes of entrepreneurship and the ropes of social activism. And now I take those two things into two different alleyways, the nonprofit one and my own nonprofit, Needed But Forgotten, kind of goes into the venture space with what I'm doing on campus, but also my internships. And then the social justice one really presents itself on social media for me. And so I started up as a kind of micro influencer on TikTok and on Instagram, really with the mission of promoting lifestyle for youth empowerment, activism, specifically for the South Asian community, but really for any cause, and really instilling the belief that youth can be the change and they can make the change on their own. And then fashion and dance. And so with those three kind of niche areas, and using, again, social media marketing skills, I try to combine that activism, social media, and venture space together.
That's a lot, and you're still having a full semester studying away. It's like, I'm impressed, and like I'm really happy that you're able to do all that stuff, because all the stuff that you're talking about like doing is really cool, really interesting and much needed, especially in terms of like talking about like the social activism aspect. So my question is like, why did you decide that this is something that you want to do? Like because you could pick all other things that you could do that could not only help with like your studies and like networking and all that stuff, but why specifically social activism? Because that really, I think, really makes you stand out. Obviously, I guess it makes you stand out, but at the same time, like, it's a lot of work. And I don't want to make it in a way where it's like, oh yeah, the payoff might not be as high, but in the sense of like, it's a lot of work that you can't foresee whether or not it will be beneficial until like much later. So like, what really motivated you to be like, oh, I'm in school, I should still think about doing that as well?
Yeah, so that's a question I get all the time. Just because, especially being a marketing major in the business school, people see it as not as lucrative. And that's one of the biggest stereotypes and misbeliefs in the business world to begin with. And so I think working marketing, social media, and venture capital has honestly taught me that with your degree, you can do anything that you want. And so I've taken what I've learned from social media activism into a part-time job during the semester. And that part-time job has led me to a billion other opportunities and people that I've been able to meet. And I think when you mention networking, sometimes we think that we have to go the traditional route of reaching out on LinkedIn. But honestly, Kyle, you found me through my Instagram page, and then we were able to build a network together. And if there's any other people that I know on Instagram that fit your profile of the podcast, I'll be happy to connect you to them. And that is how a true network, I think, is built. It's when you're actually able to understand who the person is, what their story is, and then genuinely help them without this transactional belief, or without having to ask them for something, but really just for the sense of building a community. And so when I was able to realize that and actually live by those roots, I think the rest just kind of fell into place. When I stopped, chasing the traditional path of what people expected, going into potentially finance, even though that's not what really made me happy and not what I was good at. When I just followed my strengths and what I would enjoy doing on a daily basis, I found myself equally as lucrative right now in the time and space as my peers. And so I think you can make your job whatever you want to do, but when you really, really are passionate about it, and when you're able to connect the dots of all your interests, it can lead itself to a bazillion opportunities.
I love like you're able to talk about all those things so eloquently, and like, yeah, it makes sense. And before we get into all your kind of nonprofit and all the stuff you do in terms of social activism and stuff, because I have a lot of questions about that as well. But I want to just talk about like just social activism and your thoughts on it, because a lot of times in terms of like when people talk about, oh, social media activism, there's always a bad rep in my opinion of like how people perceive it, or like, oh, it's all talk and all that stuff. But obviously with how you're moving around, you try and make an impact and making moves and stuff. Like, can you just talk about what are some of the common things that you kind of encounter in terms of not necessarily negative, but like hurdles or challenges when you are approaching these kind of things that you're trying to do with social media activism?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm going to start off by saying that the biggest thing that people say is what you mentioned, right? It's all talk and you're not actually doing anything. And so with that, I say first pick a niche. My niche is youth empowerment, and it's kind of a special one because what I like to do is help other youth find their passions and then go become change makers in their communities. But if we're taking a more simple example, where let's take a student I worked with who worked with cyberbullying. So cyberbullying was his niche. Now, what the common, I guess, stereotype is, or why people don't really like social media activism is, let's say he just posted about, here are resources that you should adhere to, or like reposted other brands. While that's an amazing, amazing start, what people want to see is, are you adhering to this? Do you have any stories where you were affected or you knew someone affected? Why do you even care about this cause? And so when you're picking the niche, it's always really important to do some introspection and reflection to see, why am I interested in this cause? And then share that with your audiences, because once you're able to establish that empathic connection, they're more willing to just listen. When you have your audience attention listening, then resource pages are great and obviously a great start. Reposting other like sites and corporations, again, a great start to just spread the awareness. But aside from awareness, that's where the action and the actual change making comes in. And so what I like to do is I like to sit down these change makers that I want to help and brainstorm with them, what is going on in your community? What are the initiatives right now for that cause? Why aren't they working? And then what do you have in your skill set that you can add to the problem that will be some fix, even if it's a small fix, even if it's let's get together 3 more students and brainstorm, because that's a small fix working towards something. And once you see people working towards things, then they're more willing to even look at your page and look at the activism that you're doing. So I don't want to say it's, you have to only take action and you can't be talk, because I do think talk is powerful, but talk is powerful when you're able to connect with the person and connect to the audience. And that's only done through actually pouring out your heart and telling them, why you're doing this and why it's so important to you.
Yeah, I think talking is very important. I mean, everyone, regardless if they support or not, it's always want a story. And if you're able to tell a story, especially a personal one, to support your cause or whatever you were fighting for, I think that's more powerful than be like, oh, here's stuff that very feel impersonal. Because I think people still want a connection with whoever it is, regardless of what cause it is. And continuing my kind of question about like social activism, I feel like another thing that I am really impressed by you is like you're able to, I feel, use social media in a very great way where a lot of people are like, where, oh, I'm just using it to connect with people or whatnot, but you're having impact and all that stuff. So how do you have time to kind of make sure you are using it in a good way, but doesn't get sucked into it? Because sometimes, a lot of time, burnout can happen and all that stuff.
Yeah, 100%. So I face burnout too. I'm not gonna pretend and be sitting here and telling you that every day I wake up and I'm like, I love activism, I love social media, I'm just gonna get to it, because that's just not reality. And reality is, when you're doing something for a long time and when you are working this hard, you're gonna face burnout. So that's where mental health comes into play for me. I think it's really important to still have time where you're not just doing work, even if your work is your passion, even if, my podcast, it's my side hobby, but it still becomes work because I care so much about it and because I'm managing a team. So have some other things that are just for your mental health. For me, that's poetry reading. And that is, cooking and learning new recipes. And that's just hanging out with my dance friends and choreographing random things to TikTok videos, or doodling on my iPad and then creating those images into potentially stickers. Right. So all of these random things that maybe not a lot of people know about me, but those are my kind of me time. And so I think it's important to have that. But while you have that, let that be a time where you're resting your mind and still thinking about innovative things, and creative things. Because I think when we give our mind that rest, that's when some of your best ideas come out. When it's all go, go, go and all planning, then sometimes we can get caught up in this race without really thinking about the details. And an example I'll give is when I started the podcast, What Cause Inspires You. For the very first time, I had done a bunch of work on my one episode and I was ready to launch. And I actually did launch. I launched my first episode and it went really well. But I was like, this is going too fast. I have people already lined up for more episodes. I don't have a structure. So I took a 2-week break just to rest my mind and do some planning on my own before I actually commenced the rest of the podcast. So it's okay to take those breaks. You're not on some kind of timeline, especially when you're doing a project for yourself. It really helps in just avoiding burnout and then being sustainable in your work.
That's great. And I think a lot of people listening could learn a lot from what you said, because I think a lot of people feel burnout, like I need to be on social media for work or for whatever cause they want to support, but sometimes it's a bit too much and they need to figure out a way to not get burned out. Exactly. So we spent a lot of time talking about like what you do and all the amazing stuff you do, but I want to like highlight the specific things that you're really passionate about, which is your podcast and can you just towards this end of the podcast talk about all those and then talk about where they could find you and your work?
Yes, for sure. So what my podcast is, What Cause Inspires You. It is on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Music. And if you go to my Instagram at Alisha, ALISHA _G9, you can find a link tree in my bio and that'll have all the links you need, or just look up my name and the podcast name on Google. But essentially why I started this podcast was because I started my nonprofit, Needed But Forgotten. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I started this nonprofit and I was 17 years old, and it had a first run and it was successful. But I was like, I want to expand, and I'm talking to investors and I don't have any resources specifically catered for youth. There was resources for like maybe professionals who were already, doing the entrepreneurial journey, or maybe, CEOs of nonprofits, but there was none for like a 17-year-old girl who's just really passionate about social impact and wants to learn more about entrepreneurship. And so that's when I started What Cause Inspires You, talking about my personal story about cyberbullying and nonprofits and how, I want to take action on it. And then I learned there were so many other students who felt the exact same way, who had done something absolutely incredible and just needed their voice to get out there and get some more recognition. And so that was the birth of the podcast series. And since then, we've also expanded to have a professional perspective series that features CEOs and celebrities in the social impact space. We also offer scholarships for outstanding change makers. And we have a Cause of the Month event that kind of combines all into a network where we can connect students to professionals and challenges based on a specific cause every month, really emphasizing action and storytelling and empathy. And so those are all of our programs. And again, you can find it on What Cause Inspires You on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Music. And then I'll brief very quickly over my nonprofit since I didn't mention it, but it's called Needed But Forgotten. Essentially, it's a digital marketplace that connects any excess goods to charitable organizations worldwide through AI matching. It wasn't always like that. It started off with just a few suitcase donations from Samsonite to foster agencies around California. And really what I use the nonprofit for, while I do want to establish it fully, was for my own exploration of entrepreneurship and social media and the intersection of the two. And I'm still going to continue to, foster it and grow it more so I can keep learning about the industry and then use what I learned to help other students and other youth entrepreneurs.
That's awesome. And I'm really happy to hear your story, hear your this perspective on things and all the cool things that you're doing. And I wish you nothing but the best for all those causes, and good luck in your studies. And hopefully people listen to this will feel inspired and be the change maker that you're hoping people could be getting into because of what you do as well. And again, thank you so much for doing this and spending your time with the podcast. And again, thank you so much for doing this, and all the best to you. Okay.
Thank you so much, Kyle.
All right. And this is all for today. And thank you for listening. And until next time, this is What Kind of Asian Are You podcast.